Imagine being asleep in your home when out of nowhere FBI agents break down your front door, throw a flashbang grenade in, drag you out in handcuffs, and then hold your wife at gunpoint, all because they actually got the wrong house. Now here's the kicker: when you tried to hold the government accountable for their mistake, the government argues that you cannot sue them and they cannot be held accountable. Well, that's the exact situation that was all the way up in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court issued a 9-0 unanimous decision actually in this case, and they ruled in favor of the family. So let's talk about what happened in this critical case and where this case is now heading as a response of that unanimous ruling. Now, before we break into this video, I want to ask you guys that if you want to support the channel, please consider subscribing to the channel. That, of course, helps the channel to grow. It'd be cool to try to reach 900,000 subscribers before the end of the year. And then also just double check to make sure YouTube has not unsubscribed you, because they love to do that, especially on two-way videos. As I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be discussing a recent 9-0 unanimous ruling by the Supreme Court, which all gun owners should be aware of. This case is called Martin versus the United States, and it comes out of a suburban area in Atlanta, where in 2017, the FBI executed a pre-dawn raid, but the only problem was that they got the wrong home. The family inside the home sued the federal government under the Federal Tort Claims Act, also known as the FTCA. The question in this case became, does the federal government get to walk away from liability, or can ordinary citizens hold them accountable just like a private person who maybe made the same mistake and kicked down the wrong door? And now the Supreme Court's 9-0 decision has overturned the lower court's ruling, and they have sent the case back down for re-review because they said that the FBI could be held accountable potentially. However, currently the DOJ was able to stall this case temporarily. Now here's what happened in this case. FBI Special Agent Lawrence Guerrera was tasked with leading a pre-dawn raid at a home where suspected gang members were and potentially where they were hiding. The target address was a specific address, but instead of going there directly, the FBI agent here used his own personal GPS. I believe he put it in his phone. Now, when he put that address in his GPS, it actually took him to a completely different home, and it took him to the home of Katrina Martin, where she lived with her boyfriend at the time, and then also a 7-year-old son. Now, when the FBI agents arrived at the home, they smashed in the front door without warning, detonated flashbangs, pulled out the boyfriend who was in a closet. I believe he was hiding. They handcuffed him. They pulled out Katrina Martin. She was half dressed at the time. They held her at gunpoint, and they also pulled out the child. Now, after the agents had detained the family, they did a search of the home. And while performing that search of the home, one of the agents noticed that there was some mail on a coffee table, and the address on that mail was the wrong address. That's when they realized that they had actually hit the wrong house. And that's when the FBI agents really had this huge oh crap moment. We raided the wrong home. Now, in response to this wrongful raid, the family sued the FBI. They brought a claim under the Federal Tort Claims Act, which is the law that allows ordinary people to sue the federal government for certain wrongful acts by federal employees when those employees are acting in the scope of their jobs. Now, normally the government is shielded from things like qualified immunity and other types of immunities, but the FTCA is one of those situations where the government has agreed to let ordinary people bring these types of claims in courts. But the FTCA also comes with a long list of exceptions where you cannot sue the federal government and these employees. Two of those exceptions were at issue in this case. The first is called the intentional tort exception. Normally, you can't sue the federal government for intentional wrongs like assault, battery, false arrest, or malicious prosecution. Now, the second is called the discretionary function exception. That exception shields the federal government from wrongful acts that stem from an official making a discretionary decision, meaning a decision that involves judgment, choice, or policy considerations. So in this case, the family tried to sue the FBI and its agents under the FTCA, but the government claimed that they fell under certain exceptions of the FTCA, like the discretionary function exception. Essentially, here the FBI argued that the use of the personal GPS was a discretionary function. It was a discretionary choice by that FBI agent, and therefore he was still immune. Now, when the family filed their lawsuit in a federal district court in Georgia, the government moved to dismiss the case, arguing that both the intentional tort and discretionary function exceptions barred this type of lawsuit. Now, the district court sided with the federal government, they sided with the FBI, and then this case made its way to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. And on review, the 11th Circuit ruled in favor of the FBI. This case then made its way to the United States Supreme Court. A cert petition was filed, and the Supreme Court granted review to this case. And on review, the Supreme Court issued a 9-0 unanimous ruling in favor of the family. The Supreme Court, in that unanimous opinion written by Justice Neil Gorsuch, vacated the 11th Circuit's decision and sent the case back down to the 11th Circuit for a new ruling in light of what they said. Now, the Supreme Court held first that the law enforcement proviso only modifies the intentional tort exception. It does not override all the other exceptions to the FTCA. That may sound like a technical point, but what matters most is because the lower court had this kind of catch-all immunity that they tried to apply, the Supreme Court found issue with that type of ruling. Based on that, the Supreme Court vacated the 11th Circuit's decision and remanded this case back down to them for further consideration in light of this new ruling. Now, recently, the 11th Circuit ordered that the federal government needed to file a supplemental brief to outline how that new Supreme Court 9-0 ruling actually is going to impact this case going forward. But the DOJ was able to get an extension. They currently have an extension on having to file that supplemental response, and they have until November 21st. Now, they argue that they need that additional time because currently the government is shut down, and currently that prevents them from working on this case. But regardless, eventually the federal government is going to have to respond to this new ruling that came from the Supreme Court, and they're going to have to relitigate and re-argue this at the 11th Circuit level. Now, you may be asking yourself, what does any of this have to do with gun owners? Well, here's why this is so important. Wrong house raids, mistaken identity arrest, and excessive force situations disproportionately impact a lot of law-abiding gun owners. This happens to a lot of gun owners, and there's a lot of highly publicized situations where we see this play out. And when these raids go bad, especially when gun owners are involved, usually someone's armed, the police officers, or potentially the gun owner acts in self-defense, and oftentimes these mistakes can lead to deadly consequences. And if the government can hide behind discretion every time it messes up, there is no accountability. There's no accountability for the federal agency, and there's no accountability for these officers. The Supreme Court's ruling here in this Martin case narrows the government's ability to avoid lawsuits by claiming this type of broad immunity. It reinforces that federal agents can be held accountable when they recklessly invade someone's home or misuse their powers. So that's what just happened in another significant 9-0 unanimous ruling issued by the Supreme Court, and that's how it's now going to impact this case going forward. It's back in the hands of the 11th Circuit. They're going to re-review this case, re-rule on this case. Currently, they've ordered for the DOJ to file a response to this case in light of what just happened at the Supreme Court level. They've argued for supplemental briefs. They want a new brief based on that Supreme Court order. And right now, the federal agency was able to delay that response because of the government shutdown, but they will have to respond to this new ruling. So that's what's currently going on. As we get more information, as it develops more, I will let you guys know. If you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to subscribe to the channel. That, of course, helps the channel to grow. You can also check out these videos here on the screen, playing here on the end screen, if you want to check out some other types of two-way content that the YouTube algorithm thinks maybe you will find interesting. So as always, thank you guys so much for all of your support. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.